Thursday already. It's looking like we're in for a quite bright weekend, which is encouraging. I've got quite a lot of things that I want to do at this weekend, so I'm hoping the weather kind of stays with me. So, welcome everybody. We're going to be talking around the cycle of transformation. Some of you might be aware of this, some of you might get a good insight into some of the things well-being. So, very quick introduction. Obviously, I welcome everybody. You've joined Isseropia. We do this platform once every week, Thursdays fortnightly and Fridays fortnightly. So you can join us at any time you wish. This is a public platform. We are currently on Facebook, I believe, and YouTube. So we would ask for any comments that you might have or some experiences that you might have had. So please share them with us, and we can have a discussion around that. And hopefully we'll be able to give you a little bit of insight that helped myself and Emily. So my name's Neil. I'm a wellbeing coach here. I've been working with Isseropia for about 3 years. I've had my own mental health issues, and I've managed, thankfully, to kind of work my way through some of those. So I'm actually quite a good place now. With me today is Emily. And she's a wellbeing coach as well. So if you'd like to introduce yourself very quickly.
Yeah, so I've been a wellbeing coach here for about 7 months, nearly 8 months now, and working at Isseropia just to kind of help in the workings of giving out those tools and those skills to help others to reach their full potential through changing their thought processes. And actually it's helped me majorly. So yeah.
Fantastic. So we're going to crack on. We've got about 30 minutes. If we need to go over a little bit, we will, but we're going to be discussing this for about 30 minutes. And this is something that really helped me to kind of identify when we're having behavioral changes, anything in terms of your mental well-being. It could be some simple things like maybe losing weight or trying to exercise a little bit more, or even, giving up smoking, or maybe changing a relationship that might have kind of broken down a little bit, or whatever. There is always a cycle that we go through. And I think some people are not really aware of certain aspects of this. And I don't know if anybody feels this themselves, but sometimes you get to a certain stage and something goes wrong, and then you kind of feel that guilt and that worry that you've done lots of things and it's not really working for you, so you kind of just give up. Have you had those situations yourself?
Definitely. Just feel deflated, and you're like, well, what's the point, because it didn't go how I wanted it to go, so I'm just not going to try anymore.
Not going to try again. And I have much the same experiences when I wanted to give up smoking once. I'm still a smoker now, but I kind of just felt at the point in time that I hadn't recognized that there's a cycle that you go through. And you need to be kind of comfortable with any kind of behavioral change. So we're going to just have a look at this thing. And the first stage that we go through is something called pre-contemplation. And this really is sometimes when you're either completely unaware that you need to make some behavioral changes, or you're kind of sitting in denial, not understanding the reasons why, and you're kind of ignorant to kind of the kind of things.
I think when I was really poorly for ages, everyone around me was telling me that I was poorly, and I just was like, no, I'm not. And I was in denial for such a long time because it was kind of my protection zone, and it was kind of my way of blocking out the world and blocking out the issues, because if I didn't realize that there was an issue, then I didn't have to do anything about it, and then that was how I protected myself. So yeah.
And I was looking at something online yesterday, and I kind of reflect back on my experiences as well. And sometimes people can sit in pre-contemplation for extremely long periods of time. And I look back on mine, and I probably sat in that kind of area in denial, thinking that I could deal with it myself for probably about 10 years. So pre-contemplation is really something that when you've kind of realized that you might have to start rethinking things. And then you will probably end up moving to the next stage, which we'll go into now. So this is called contemplation. And this is really when you're starting to realize yourself that maybe you need to make some changes. You know, going back to the thing that I said, you know, with in terms of the smoking, for instance, I started to then really contemplate, because I was being given feedback about things like, are you aware the impact on your health? Are you aware that sometimes when you come out of meetings, you stink of cigarettes? So you're starting to kind of rethink things, and you're thinking for yourself, and you're thinking, hang on, maybe there is some kind of change that needs to take place.
Yeah, and I think also this stage can be quite frightening, because you're in a situation where you know that there's some issues and you're not really sure how to identify those barriers, how to kind of move forward. You're like, okay, well, I know I need to stop smoking, for example, but how do I get to that end goal? And you're just kind of quite conflicted, and you're feeling a bit lost, I'd say.
Absolutely. There is definitely a conflict in emotions, without doubt, is there not? So, you know, sometimes, again, in terms of contemplating, that can take quite a period of time in itself, can't it? You know, and why we go through these stages is it's not something that happens relatively quickly. The cycle of transformation, you know, I've done a little bit of work around this. Sometimes we need to go around this cycle probably 10, 15 times until we've kind of got to the point where we can maintain it, and we can maintain it, and it becomes almost second nature.
It becomes habit.
Becomes very, very habitual. So when we're talking about contemplating, that is really kind of starting to think about things like Emily's just said. You've got to start thinking about identifying the barriers that you might come across. You know, weighing up the pros and cons. You know, if I, for instance, we keep talking about the smoking situation, what are the pros and the cons? For me, the pros were obviously it would improve my health and my well-being. It'd probably make me smell a bit better. But the cons were the fact that I actually enjoyed, in social situations, having a cigarette.
And the stress related.
And the stress related as a result of not having that cigarette. And that, again, from a mental health perspective, can be quite daunting, damaging, effectively, because if you're getting, you know, constantly stressed, we're talking about cigarettes here, you know, you start to have to then kind of weigh everything up. We often talk at Isseropia, don't we, about balance. And this is balancing the pros and the cons, looking at it from a real kind of helicopter view, big perspective. So you go through that contemplation, and then the next stage that you really will start to do is things around preparation. When we're talking about preparation, many of you will probably identify when we get to New Year, for instance, and people make New Year's resolutions. And they kind of work, they prepare things from the 1st of January. I am going to go on my health regime, and I'm going to go on my diet, or I'm going to start doing a bit more exercise.
And then that like, say the December period of when you're like deciding what your New Year's resolution is going to be, that's the contemplation period, and you're like, okay, what's that going to look like for my next year? How am I going to do that? What's it going to feel like? All of those things, and then you can start to collect all this information in your head that's like, this is the next step in my life, this is the next stage that I need to take, and mentally prepare yourself for those changes, because change can be quite scary. So it definitely needs some kind of preparation.
Any kind of change is scary, and that's why when we talk about the cycle, you have to do each part of it, because it does become quite really scary. But when you're prepping, you know, if it's something that is something you can achieve, it will be things. Let's just go on to, let's say that somebody wants to actually get a new healthier regime exercise wise. The preparation time would really be about identifying, right, I need to go and buy myself some trainers. I really need to set a date and a time of when I'm going to be able to undertake this regime
in a sensible manner as well. There's no point setting yourself, right, I'm going to work out 7 days a week for 2 hours, doing it like, okay, I'm going to in January say I'm going to give myself a target to work out twice a week for half an hour.
Absolutely. So we're talking now about starting to write things down. You have to really start thinking about goal planning. So you have to write down some goals that you want to achieve. You know, a lot of people will possibly write goals that, one, are unachievable, and two, sometimes they can be too quick, too advanced, especially when we're talking about things like exercise regimes or whatever it might be. So we really need to start thinking about proper goal setting, and then obviously the plan of action, a bit like Lucy just said. So, you know, on a Wednesday at 2 o'clock, I am going to set some time to one side to concentrate my efforts on this. So that's the preparation. And once you've got the preparation done, it's the biggest for me, the biggest step. And when we're talking about the next step, that is when we have to take control. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely.
Because we've done all of this work, and now we need to put this into action. So when we're talking about that, we need to start thinking about, if we take action, there's things that are important, I feel, myself, and that's things like rewards.
Yeah, definitely.
So once you've achieved something, is really giving yourself a reward, whether that be something tangible or whether it be something that you talk about. It might be that you actually change your dialogue and you change the way of talking to yourself, saying, I'm really proud that I did that today. And that builds self-esteem. It also builds motivation. It also builds you the ability to actually extend and achieve your goals, which is a really, really good part. So the action really is when kind of we come in and we seek as much help as we possibly can. A lot of people would get a lot of benefit from maybe buddying up with somebody, social support. A lot of people get really, really good motivation when they go to a gym, for argument's sake.
Or runners club, I think.
Or runners clubs.
Or like a get fit workout group, and then you have other motivating factors that allow you to say, oh, I have to go because then I get to see this person or this person, and it becomes less about the chore. Or like say you're trying to repair your relationship with exercise and you're trying to get yourself to exercise more, you can then start to say, okay, it's less about the exercise and it's more about other things, which can be really beneficial and really motivating as well. And these first 3 steps, so preparation, contemplation and pre-contemplation, are like behind the scenes work, and action is like the main stage event, which I think is such an important place, because that's how you come out of your comfort zone.
Absolutely. And this is probably where I would say, I don't know how you feel, Emily, this is where people get stuck, and then they feel that they have to go through the whole process again. But what I'm trying to get to there is, you've probably done a lot of those steps, so the action's the most important thing. And we'll talk in a minute about, you know, putting the action in place, and if something happens, that's the next kind of stage that we're going to be talking about. So it would be really interesting if any of you guys have got something from this, where you might have gone through this cycle and you found yourself changing a behavior that has actually given you some benefit. It'd also be interesting to see if anybody's kind of gone through this and then found themselves possibly not being able to overcome an obstacle. Because we'll talk in a minute about how we can identify those things, and we'll go into, you know, stage 6. I think we're going to be talking about that. Stage 5, is it? But anyway, once you're in action, you've actually started to then kind of almost starting to retrain your brain a little bit. So what we talk often about neuro pathways and change in behaviors, it takes quite a period of time. So when you're done the action for quite a period of time, it's really then moving into the next stage, which is basically what I call maintenance. So this is really just keep on maintaining the behavioral change that you've undertaken. And it's things like avoiding temptations to put things off. We often talk about we need to treat our mental well-being the same as we would do with any other commitment in our lives. You know, if I said to you, you have a dentist appointment at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, you would do everything around making sure that you achieve that appointment.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you don't actually go to that appointment, what's the consequences likely to be? You're probably going to end up having toothache, or at least you're not going to be able to get back in. And, you know, there's a lot of people that, you know, lose dentists as a result of that. But, you know, the same things, doctor's appointments, picking up the children from school. I know it sounds blasé, but we actually make that a priority. And when we're talking about changing our behaviors, that's exactly what we've got to do. We've got to continue to maintain it. And some people will find maintenance extremely difficult, but you can sit in maintenance, but, you know, relatively is once you get there and you maintain it, it becomes a bit like you said a little earlier. It becomes easier and easier and easier to maintain because you've got all the other nuts and bolts.
And it becomes your new norm.
It becomes your normal.
Yeah. And I think that stage 5 and stage 4, so the maintenance and the action can like flip and change quite a lot, because it's all about trial and error, this cycle, and all about making sure that the action is the right action for you and it's still healthy and it's still beneficial. So if you say you've done one action, and then so we were talking before about starting running, and then okay, we're running, we're doing really well on that path, and then get shin splints. So then you have to come back to the action stage and the the preparation stage, and say, okay, I've got shin splints. How do I continue this journey in a healthy way, but a bit differently, because and maintain it around your life. So say, for example, say you were in a job and you were able to go to the gym 3 times a week, or you're able to go to running club 3 times a week, and then you changed jobs and you had to work different hours. It's about, okay, coming back to that preparation stage and saying, okay, we need to reformulate my plan and then action it again and then maintain it, so that it doesn't have to be like just a circle. It can go up and down and around.
Which is that's a really interesting point, because we were going to go on to that for this one, because this is where I found was really hard, and this is something called a lapse or a relapse. I'll put it down as relapse, but this is identifying something and changing the way that you look at it, how you perceive it, because life is life. That's the way I put it. Things will always kind of get in the way.
Yeah.
And a lot of people then find when they get into this lapse that their mindset starts to change a little bit. They'll say, do you know, I did all that and it didn't work, so I'm not doing it again.
Yeah.
Or that's come across, that's a big obstacle for me. So I'll tell you what, rather than taking the stress and the hassle of changing it, I'll give up.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about lapse, a little bit like Emily's saying, this is the time when the motivation has to kick in.
Yeah.
And you may well have to step back, like Emily's just saying, to a certain part. But invariably, and I'll talk about my experience with, because you've almost touched on it really, invariably, we don't recognize that and we just give up. And I'm just going to talk very quickly, like Emily just highlighted that. I did exactly the same. I use it in my workshops, do I not? I used to, I went through this stage. I realized that I needed to actually focus more attention on my exercise regime because that was having a massive impact on my mental well-being.
Mm.
And I undertook running. And I kind of went through this subconsciously, but I got to the stage where I was starting to run half marathons.
Yeah.
I was running every day, probably 8-10 miles. And believe it or not, I got shin splints. And at that stage, I did actually make the decision that I was fully aware of the mental help it was giving me, and the exercise, and my body was improving and all things like that. So rather than stopping, I then went back and had to look at planning again.
Yeah.
So I couldn't run, and I couldn't run for probably about 3 months.
Yeah.
So I could have just said, right, let's become a couch potato again. But I wouldn't allow myself to do that. So what I did is I changed my regime. I went back to my planning stage and started to think, rather than running, I can walk.
Yeah.
And then I basically started the walking, and believe it or not, I just jumped straight back into maintenance. It was a different plan, a different way of doing it, but I didn't allow myself to then just say stop, because like you said, I will be straight back to the beginning of the cycle.
Yeah. And I think this stage is a lot about what we talk in our workshops. You can fall into that black and white thinking, that all or nothing thinking, can't you? You can say, well, I have to do this plan, and if I don't do this plan, then everything else is ruined. So this bit is about challenging that and saying, right, just because this bit didn't work for like this moment in time, it doesn't mean that it will never work, and I just need to go at it in a different path, which I think can be disappointing sometimes if you've gone through like a significant period of time prepping and mentally preparing yourself to have this change. And especially because a lot of people, like I'm one of those people that doesn't really like change. Change isn't super comfortable for me. So that
I don't think you're alone on that one.
So that kind of setback can be quite challenging, and it's about challenging your thought process about that cycle and saying, okay, this isn't the end, this is just a setback or a step to the side.
Absolutely. And what I've written a few things down, Emily. When we get into that kind of lapse, I call it, rather than relapse,
horrible,
but
yeah.
lapse is a lapse. But what are the characteristics that are likely to happen? You will no doubt become very, very disappointed with yourself. That feeds into your self-esteem. And then you start to lack motivation and all those things that really have an impact on our mental well-being.
Yeah.
So it's not just losing the physical side of that. There's a massive mental impact on that as well, isn't there? You get extremely frustrated with yourself, most importantly, but you also probably get frustrated, which then shows possibly for some people elements of anger, elements of all different characteristics that have an impact on our mental well-being. And then most importantly, and many people get this, they have that sense of failure. They have that real sense of failure that it does really causes issues. We often talk about, our self-esteem, and once you get that element of failure and that's niggling in your head, has a huge impact.
Something that's really helpful with that for me is that failure or fail means first attempt in learning.
It's a brilliant phrase. I absolutely love that, because you're absolutely right. First attempt in learning. And this is really about, I often talk about this in my workshops, is about the language that we possibly use ourselves. I often talk about some of the mental health concerns that we have. And I sometimes, just for me, I get a little bit frustrated about how simple it is to use a word. And you kind of, forgive me for saying this is just my experience, you kind of live by that identity. Is that making sense? So when we're talking about the fear of failure, when we have that lapse, you kind of back to that identity.
Yeah. And if you just change that to fear of learning, that's a completely new thing. That's a completely different thing. And it's easier to bypass through that.
Exactly. And it
Whereas,
becomes a lot softer, doesn't it?
yeah.
And it's a lot easier to deal with. So I like that first attempt in failure. And I often use that myself. So when you get to a lapse, you've really got to just do some simple things. You need to identify the trigger, the thing that has kind of moved you back towards maybe the same pathway. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
I had a situation where I was giving up smoking, and then it was recognized, unfortunately, that I had a lapse. I had a cigarette. But then I started to identify. I'd had an extremely stressful day. I was in the wrong kind of environment, which kind of my trigger was kind of there, and I didn't have enough motivation to kind of move away from those triggers, and I had a cigarette. But I changed my mindset as also, Emily, because I kind of, somebody said to me, I knew you wouldn't do that, Neil. And I kind of, in my own head, said, hang on a minute. I have stopped smoking for nearly 3 weeks now. So you haven't considered the amount of work that I've done. You've only taken the snapshot of that one lapse. And that became second nature to me. I don't know how you feel, but then that was so much softer for me, so much easier to just go, all I've got to do is I've identified it now and correct it. And I was back into maintenance.
Yeah. And it's like that. We can all have off days, and that's absolutely fine. We can all have days where we just can't face it that day, and kindness to ourselves is the most important thing. But yeah, getting back on track is the main part of how you stay in maintenance. And Ruth says, I relate failure to the same as a baby learning to walk. No matter how many times they fall, they still get up and master it, which is so true. Like babies, and I think we were talking about this in the office yesterday, or maybe it was at the public workshop, that we learn to fear failure as adults, whereas babies and young children, they don't have that. They just are like just walking around doing their own thing. And so they're constantly learning, and they're constantly in this cycle of transformation, and they don't even realize. But for adults, it takes that a little bit more conscious effort.
Absolutely. And again, I don't want to get into scientific stuff, but I think I've read in quite a lot of journals and things that a baby's wiring in their brain happens over 7 years. When they get to probably the age of around 7, that's when all the things that you're talking about, they've now got an imagination. They've discovered the world, and they have the sense of fear. They have the sense of consequences and stuff like that. But I like the fact, with what Ruth's saying, when you're a young child, you don't have the senses of anything around those kinds of things. You're just into discovery mode, and it becomes a lot harder, like you said, when you kind of growing up. But I think the point that we're trying to say here before we conclude is there is always a cycle. So like we said right from the beginning, it might take a period of time to identify that you need some kind of behavioral change. And all I'd say there, any of you guys that have worked with Isoropia or any other place, just to imagine how long possibly it took some of us to even take that first step, reaching out for some help. And I remember, again, when I was in the denial stage, I thought I was a big man and I'd be able to do this and conquer it on my own. And then I kind of stepped onto the cycle. And, the consequences now, I'm not into lapse, but I am in maintenance. But I will continue to stay in maintenance by making sure that the actions that I've set myself, I do. Is that making sense?
And are achievable.
But if, let's just say, for argument's sake, things change, my head now tells me that all I have to do is go back. If I change, let's just say, for argument's sake, before we conclude, that there was a massive job change and I actually lost my job.
Yeah.
I wouldn't really just naturally now say, all I have to do is go back to preparation,
Yep.
identify some things, move into action, and then back to maintenance.
Yeah.
It's not really going to cause too many issues.
Yeah.
So I hope you guys, I know it's half an hour, I hope you guys got something from that. If you kind of identify with that, there's a lot of websites. If you just put in the cycle of transformation, there's some really good pictures, there's some good ways of identifying some of the areas that we've spoken about this morning. Isopropia, we are now self-referral, so if you require any kind of mental health assistance or help, then please give us a call. You can see on the screen now, we do have a website, isopropia.uk. There's information on there. Please check out. Any of you that need any additional support, then just give us a ring on 217791. And we look forward to seeing you again very shortly. So thank you very much, Emily. And thank you, audience, for listening to us today. And we'll speak to you soon.
Cool. Thank you.